I remember around Thanksgiving 1989, my mother says to me, she says, Collier, I want you to know that I would never leave you. And I was like, okay, Mommy, of course not. And I understand. And she said, and if I do, I want you to know that your father probably had me killed.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Bunny Hugs and Mental Health. I am your host, Todd Rennebaum. This episode has been sponsored by SUN, Saskatchewan Union of Nurses, the hardest working and most amazing people I know. Thank you so much for everything you do and everything you're going to do. Boy, do we have a doozy of an episode this week. My guest is Collier Landry, and when he was about 11 or 12 years old, he heard his father murder his mother. He'll talk about all that. Super great guy. We actually talked for like over 2 hours. The episode's only about an hour, but we talked lots. I think we're going to do a second episode to discuss more the PTSD and how he got over the trauma of it all. Because we didn't really get into that. We mostly got into the story because it's one hell of a story. But anyway, that's coming up. Also coming up this Monday, April 10th on Instagram. I'm doing an Instagram live with my friend Allie. She is an ADHD coach, and we're going to talk about, ADHD stuff. So check that out. That's on Bunny Hugs Podcast on Instagram. And next week's episode is another incredible episode. I'm speaking with my good friend Jeremy Evans. All these people are my friends now, by the way. We not necessarily friends before, but Jeremy and I are good friends now. We actually plan on doing some speaking together and stuff. Anywho, Jeremy was mauled by a bear, and I mean mauled by a bear. His story is also just absolutely incredible. He has suffered with years of PTSD after that, and he has a new book called Mauled: Lessons Learned from a Grizzly Bear Attack. And right now he's promoting the hell out of the book. He's on all types of podcasts and stuff. And he's also got lots of swag. Wow, swag for me. It's merchandise for normal people, I guess. We've got lots of really great stuff happening. There's more wonderful episodes I could talk about, but they're in the can, and I'll talk about them later. But for this week, I'm speaking with Collier Landry. And he's also a podcaster. He's got a couple podcasts out there. I can put all that in the show notes so you can find those. He's got one podcast called Moving Past Trauma with Collier Landry. And he also co-hosts a podcast called The Survivor Squad. And he co-hosts it with Tara Newell. And if you recall Tara Newell, she was also on the podcast, this podcast. And she is the real life killer of Dirty John. And you can listen to her episode on episode 44. Plus, Collier also has a documentary that came out in 2017, A Murder in Mansfield. So anyway, you can check all that stuff out. But for now, you can check him out here. So without further ado, I give you Collier Landry.
I grew up in a really small town in Ohio called Mansfield. And probably a lot of people don't know it. Other than there's a film called The Shawshank Redemption that was filmed there. So a lot of people know that. There's a prison there. And I had moved to Mansfield with my parents. Now, my father was a doctor and my mother was a dental hygienist. But at the time that my father became a doctor, she became, she was a mother and a housewife and ran my father's books for his business. But, we had my whole family's from suburban Philadelphia, which is where I was born. And I grew up the first 5 years of my life in Virginia. And then my father got approached to run a hospital in Mansfield, Ohio. So we moved there. And we didn't have any friends or anything like that. It was sort of a new place. And not really what my parents were used to, because they were East Coast people. And here you are in the middle of the Midwest. But we made they made the most of it. But I grew up, what I thought for a long time was a fairly normal family dynamic. My father went to work, my mom was home. I was sort of my mother's constant companion if I wasn't at school and or doing some sort of extracurricular activity. So I guess I thought that my upbringing was just pretty much a normal childhood.
You had siblings?
My father did. No, not at the time. So I was an only child. And I always knew that my father had a temper. There's a lot of tiptoeing that went around. There's a lot of, uh, uh, and I think that really, I think a lot of that aggression, or at least I probably became most aware of it, was when we moved to Ohio. So I was getting a little older. I was 5 years old at the time, and I think that I think that's when I really became sort of aware that my father had a temper and that my father could be really nasty and could be very, very abusive to myself and my mother.
At that age, you can kind of compare him to other people's dads and be like,
Well. So what's interesting is and also I became sort of aware of a thing. So we came to this community, and my father was a doctor, right? So and I went to a private school. So all of my classmates were all from they were all from families that are either the father was in a professional sort of professional profession, right? They weren't necessarily blue collar workers. They were either doctors, lawyers, accountants, that type of thing. So one of the things I noticed is I started to have friends who were from single family households where divorce was a thing. And so they would go with dad or mom on the weekend, and then they would be with, mom or dad during the week. And there was this sort of split, sort of fractured household. And I wasn't really, like I said, at that time, really aware that those types of things existed, but obviously they do. And I started just kind of becoming more and more aware that my father was an abusive guy. And, when we're in the small town, like, again, no friends, like new in town. And I spent, the vast majority of my time with my mother. Like I said, if I wasn't in school or some sort of extracurricular activity. So I ended up being like her little sidekick growing up. And, when my father would exert these fits of rage and they would they would come out of things that were completely benign, right? So I remember one time my father, we were making breakfast on like a Saturday morning, and I dropped an egg on the floor, and he went ballistic and started screaming at my mother, saying he was going to kill me and kill us, and then slammed the door and broke all the windows in the door and just, terrorized us. And I think, a lot of people talk about when you talk about trauma and adverse childhood experiences, you talk about, the fight, flight, or fawn syndrome, right? Or scenario where, you begin to be the appeaser, right? And okay, daddy is not in a good mood. Let's not bug daddy. Or, or for a lot of kids that grow up in alcoholic, or households where there's addiction, when there's, they're not on their substances, or, daddy's been drinking. So now he's going to get aggressive. He's going to start beating mom or whatever. I started, my father wasn't a drinker, but I started to become aware that these were traits that he had, and that it wasn't fun, right? So again, I became hyper aware, hyper vigilant for myself and my mother at a very early age. And because he just really couldn't understand it. But and of course, when you're a child, you don't really know what the dynamics of the family really are, what his relationship is with my mother, and what's really going on, right? But I did my best to be there for my mother. And I would say that, that went on for probably until about 1989. In 1989 was sort of a year. I was 10 years old at the time, and that was a year that was a big year, literally. But at that time, 3 out of my 4 grandparents had already passed away. So my mother had lost both of her parents, and then my father had lost his father. And I noticed that things were getting more and more tense in the household. And, I was getting, like I said, I was 10. So one of the bonding things I would do with my father and my family would do is we'd go on ski trips to upstate New York and go skiing. But I would notice that, like, if my mother didn't come with us, my father would take me, obviously. And I noticed a lot of times I'd wake up in the hotel room and I'd be by myself. And I remember one time I went downstairs and I found him in the bar in the ski lodge, and he was talking to some woman. And I guess, you're so young and naive, you don't really put two and two together, but I just thought it was odd. And I think, so during 1989, my mother wanted to adopt a little girl from Taiwan. She wanted a daughter. My father apparently didn't have any interest in having another child, so she wanted to adopt a baby from China. So my mother, I was supposed to go with her to Taiwan. It was going to be a big trip, but I was also heavily asthmatic as a kid, and like really, really bad. And I got really sick right before we were supposed to fly to China or Taiwan. And so I couldn't go on the trip. So essentially I was stuck with my father for 2 weeks. And this was like in February 1989. And that was a nightmare.
I bet you he didn't like it either. He's like, God damn it, I was going to have 2 weeks alone.
I probably very much that was what was going through his head. And I would say that he really, he was very, very abusive to me while she was gone. And my father had already been abusive to me in these scenarios where, growing up. So I'm asthmatic, so I can't really play sports like my father wants me to. So I remember throwing the baseball in the backyard, and he'd try to throw it at my groin and injure me, or at my head and call me a pussy. And, he'd say things like, your mother's turning you into a little faggot and things of that nature, horrible things to say to a child. And of course, I don't even know what that means at that time. But, this time when she was gone, it was like he was full on abusive mode. And I remember I was playing a computer game, and I had unplugged the speakers to the computer because my father was watching television. And I didn't want to disturb him. I was just being really because the speakers didn't have like a switch where you could turn them down. So I just unplugged it. And I remember my father came into the room and saw me playing the game. He goes, "Why is there not any sound coming out?" And I was like, I told him I unplugged it because I was trying to be courteous. And he went off on me, and he grabbed the switch and he shoved it in my face, and he started screaming at me, and then he started throwing things at me and chasing me around the house, terrorizing me, calling me a stupid little fat boy. Your mother's going to turn you into a faggot. You're just, you're just like all this stuff. It happened. And this was a cycle of abuse that lasted for this 2 weeks while my mother was gone. My father was very much into like violent movies and things. So I would cover my face, and my father would make fun of me, yell at me, punish me for not looking at a violent scene in a movie, because I didn't want to see that shit. I was a kid, right? And I, so that was the type of guy he was, and not a very nice guy. On the flip side, my only real bonding time with my father, besides going on these ski trips, would be I would go with him on his rounds to the hospital to see his patients. And I would literally like go with him, and I had this little harmonica I kept in my pocket, and I tap dance and sing for the patients and all this stuff. So I was like a little entertainer. That was like my whole thing, right? I was really into music. I was really into singing and art and all those things, all the artsy fartsy stuff. And that was always my like escape, was arts and music and things of that nature. So my mother comes back from China, and everything's fine and dandy. He says, "Don't tell your mother any of this happened." And I'm just like, I'm so afraid of my father at this point. I'm just like, I'm not going to say a word. I'm petrified of this man. Like, I've seen a side of him that I knew existed, but now I've had to live with it for 2 weeks without somebody protecting me. And it's scary. So a few months go past, and I go on, it's Memorial Day, so it's May, and I go with my father to this random barbecue that he says is at one of his patients' houses. And they're having and it's like out in the middle of the boondocks and the sticks, and they're like racing quads, they're drinking beer, they're playing volleyball. It's all this stuff that I just I had never seen before, right? I mean, I'd seen volleyball, but people having roasting a pig and, barbecues. And so that wasn't really my parents' vibe necessarily. I mean, if it was, I grew up wearing penny loafers, for crying out loud. So I was like, you know what I mean? So I was like a little prep kid. And so seeing this whole world, I was like, wow, this is kind of cool. And I'm riding the quad and I'm like, this is awesome. Like, oh, this is so much fun, right? But I remember I met this woman, and her name was Sherry Campbell. And my father had explained to me that this was a patient of his. And I remember as we're getting ready to leave, I'm walking around this lake and I'm skipping stones with like her daughter, and we're just talking like kid stuff or whatever. I look back and my father has his arm around her. I'm like, okay, I'm filing a note on this. And we get the car and I say, Daddy, you know, why did you have your arm around that woman? And he said, well, you know, she's going through a lot of really big health challenges, and she's terminally ill. So I'm just confronting her or consoling her. I'm like, oh, that's terrible. You know, of course my heart went out, you know, I believe him, right? So flash forward a month later, it's far less than that, really. It's Father's Day, 1989. And I go with my father to go to his office because sometimes he would take me with him to run errands on the weekend. And on the way back, we stop at this suntan place because this is like the late 80s and everybody's into tanning salons. It's like the new thing, right? So my father's going to get a tan, right? And Sherry Campbell's there. And she surprises us with 2 radio controlled cars. And it's, hey, happy Father's Day. And I'm like, who is this woman? Like now I'm seeing her again and like a few weeks later, like this is super weird.
I thought she was supposed to be dead.
And yeah, I thought she was dying. You're right. And I'm thinking to myself, okay. And I see, I notice a ring on her finger. And the thing about this ring is it was very unique. And my mother had the same ring because it was like a sliding diamond ring. And I said to her, I said, oh, my mommy has a ring like that. And she just kind of giggles and she looked at my dad and I was like, okay, this is super weird. So I'm playing with the radio controlled car and I kind of look I look up as I'm doing it and they're full on making out. And I'm like, what is going on?
He was giving her mouth to mouth.
I'm like, I've only seen this in movies, right? So, and I'm just like, this is so bizarre. So we get in the car and my father says to me, because I'm just kind of like, what was that about? And he says, you know, I need you to do me a favor. I need you to lie to your mother and tell her that I took you to a medical conference, that I took you to my office and I surprised you with the radio controlled cars as a gift for getting good grades this year in school. And I was like, what? You know, and this is the first time that my father had ever asked me to lie for him. So I'm just, first of all, I'm kind of sick about it. But second of all, thinking to myself, I've never lied to my mother before. And now my father's, and now I'm in the middle of some nonsense that I don't want to be in the middle of. Like, I don't want to be in this position.
You've put the dots together at this point, I'm assuming.
Yeah, and I'm also terrified of him too.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I don't want to not lie because I don't want to get in trouble because he'll beat my ass.
Yeah.
So we go that night out to dinner, and I don't say anything. It's Father's Day, whatever. And that night I get really, really sick with really bad indigestion, and I'm like, you know, vomiting and all this stuff, and I don't sleep very good. So the next day, I'm outside, I'm playing with a radio control car. My mom's like, why don't you go play with your radio control car that your dad got you? And I'm like, okay. And I'm outside in our driveway, and I'm just so overwhelmed with guilt. Come inside the house, and my mother's out in the back porch sort of watching me. And I said, Mommy, I need you to sit down, and I need to talk to you. I said, I think Daddy's having an affair. And I start to outline this whole thing and how Sherry had the ring that my mom had. I saw them making out. I saw them, you know, I met her before at this lake, at this house with a lake, and he's had his arm around her. He said she was terminally ill and all of these things. And I just start laying out the whole thing. And she, you know, tells me essentially, you know, I'm not happy you lied to me, but I'm glad you told me the truth. And your father shouldn't have put you in that position anyways. And then she goes in the house and she makes a phone call and she's like, just livid. You know, my mother definitely had a temper as well. And she just, you know, I don't know who she was laying into or who she was screaming to, but she was not pleased. This is like when this all starts to go down. So that night I get a really weird memo from my father. He sticks in my bed. Oh, I love you. I'm not mad at you. This, that, and the other. I'm like thinking to myself, what is going on? I start to realize that maybe I am that kid who all of his friends have the same experience, which is the dads are cheating on the moms and they get a divorce. And I'm going to end up with this being a kid who's got, staying with dad on the weekends and with mom during the week and shuffled around and about, and they can't see each other this place. And they're always talking, shit about each other. And that's what my life is going to be. And it's kind of terrifying because I was under the illusion that I had a fairly normal life up until that point. Aside from my father's abuse and his sort of neglect for us as a family. And he wasn't around a lot because he was always quote unquote working. But, I ended up finding out that's all just, nonsense. I mean, he was working, but there's also other activities too. But I didn't really realize any of this because my mother did such a great job of shielding me from this because I was with her all the time, right? And she didn't ever, God rest her soul, never even let on about any of this. So the next 6 months just proceed to be absolutely just madness. My parents are getting into a divorce scenario and it just keeps escalating more and more. And every time I'm spending time with my father, we are, and I think they tried to I don't think my mother officially filed for divorce until November of 1989. So this is June of 1989, end of June. So I don't know if it was that she was just trying to get her ducks in a row or what, but my father was full on engaged with this relationship. And so he was staying outside the house. And my father, I never really seen my parents sleep in a room together for a really long time. Not that I was keeping tabs on that, but I always remember my father sleeping on the couch a lot. And he was always watching CNN late at night and things like that, or the Lakers game, or listening to, Johnny Carson at that time or whatever it was. Right. So I was always under that impression that he wasn't around or he was sleeping on the couch because he was going in and out of the hospital and he was just busy working all the time. Right. Which really wasn't the case. So, but it wasn't until November that year that my mother had officially filed for divorce. Of course, I found this out years later, but that's when things really got nasty. And my father started telling me that he's going to make sure that I go to public school, which I don't know what kind of a threat that was, but basically he's like, I'm going to make your life a living hell for you and your mother. I'm going to make sure that you guys live in poverty, that you have no support. You're not going to go to college. You're not going to do this. I'm not going to do anything for you. I'm going to give this wonderful life to my new girlfriend and this family that I'm starting, and you're out, which is a very narcissistic. You're the narcissist, right? So now, okay, you've injured me. So now I'm going to destroy your life, when it really is not that, he's obviously at that point blaming me for the divorce, blaming her for the divorce, even though this is all based on his own actions, right? And this is a very typical thing that obviously narcissists do, right? And psychopaths and sociopaths, they're disconnected and it's all about them. The injury is on them and they're going to retaliate. And therefore that justifies all their behavior and their entitlement and et cetera, right? So, it's really bad. And I remember around Thanksgiving, 1989, my mother says to me, she says, Collier, I want you to know that I would never leave you. And I was like, okay, mommy, of course not. And I understand. And she said, and if I do, I want you to know that your father probably had me killed. And I'm just like, what? And
yikes.
As shocking as that statement is, right, for a child to hear, I also kind of God, I mean, I kind of feel there's a lot of truth behind this. So, Christmas comes, and my grandmother, who is my father's mother, was supposed to come stay with us, but she was not feeling well, or she had hurt her hip or something. And ironically, my grandmother was very, very close with my mother. They were almost like sisters or like a mother-daughter relationship. It was really, they were really bonded. And because she didn't have that bond with her daughter, And my mom didn't really have that bond with her mother. So they've all, I mean, for decades they were bonded, right? And they would go shopping together and everything was great. But she didn't come for Christmas that year. Now my father wasn't really around because he was off with his girlfriend. And over this entire, scenario of the divorce and everything, I'm with my father and we're conveniently running into the girlfriend and her kids and they're shopping and doing all this stuff. And he's basically like showing how he's setting up this wonderful life for them and never, and I'm out, my mother's out. Like he's going to destroy our lives type thing. So New Year's comes and my grandmother's coming to stay with us. So it's New Year's Eve or December 30th, 1989. And my grandmother arrives late at night, like 8 o'clock at night with my father. And she's coming to stay with us. And it's great to see, my Grammy. And, I give her a kiss goodnight. I give my mother a kiss goodnight. And I go to bed. Next thing I know is I wake up in the middle of the night. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. And I'm pretty sure I hear a scream, which is what woke me up. And then I hear a really loud thud, which I would later describe as the sound of a body hitting a wall. And I hear my father's voice muttering. And about 60 seconds later, I hear another thud. And I'm terrified. And I'm looking and I always slept with my door open at night. And I was looking at this Batman clock that was on my wall and it said 3:18 a.m. And I'm looking at the clock. I'm holding on the covers and I'm obviously wide awake and I can hear these footsteps. I'm counting down the hallway and I can see out of my peripheral vision the feet land in my doorway. And I'm sitting there like this and everything inside me is like, don't look up. And I'm just pretending to be asleep. And I hear, the floor shifting and I see the feet move away out of my peripheral vision. And I somehow go back to sleep. I wake up a few hours later, it's daylight. First thing I do is I make a beeline to my mother's bedroom. And I start rummaging through the sheets and the bed is in complete state of disarray. And I'm looking for blood. I'm looking for all this stuff. I'm just trying to figure out what's going on, right? And
you had assumed he had maybe killed her.
Well, I mean, yeah, something happened for sure. And I don't see anything. And I go downstairs and my father's sitting on the couch and he's got a towel wrapped around his waist. He had just taken a shower. And I said to him, where's my mother? And he doesn't say anything. And I said, again, where is my mother? And he looks up at me and he says, well, mommy took a little vacation, Collier. And at that point I knew. And I don't know if I was 100% certain that he had just murdered her. But obviously this conversation flashes back in my mind that I'd had less than 2 months earlier with my mother. And I knew something had happened to her. I knew something had happened to her. And I knew she would never leave me anyways. So my father then goes into this whole diatribe on how we're not going to call the police. My mother's going to come back there. And then he started saying, we're not going to call the FBI. And when he said the FBI, I just remember thinking to myself, bro, that escalated quickly. And there's no CSI or anything back at this time. But I'm thinking to myself, we live in a small town in Ohio. What in the hell is the FBI going to do here? Why did we go to that? Seems a little extreme. This isn't a Tom Clancy novel, bro.
Mom went on a holiday. We're not going to call the FBI.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, just like, and he starts saying, and then he starts brainstorming on where my mother could have gone, what she was doing. She's on a shopping trip. My mother wanted to take me to Toronto. That was like one of her places that she wanted to take me. So we could go shopping in Toronto because my mother loved to shop. We would go see the CN Tower and we would go to shows up in, I don't know why. She just really wanted to go to Toronto. I thought, well, maybe mom went to Toronto. And he's like, oh, maybe Toronto. And we'll go to Toronto and everything. And she's probably there. And he's like, that's a great idea, Collier. And I'm thinking to myself, man, you are just reaching.
Registered nurses are on the front lines of this nursing crisis right now. I feel like we don't have all of the resources and the tools and the staff to ensure patient safety 100% of the time.
Everyone is trying their best, but it's not sustainable the way we're going right now. There needs to be something changing.
The nurses across Saskatchewan need to be involved in conversations with the government to try and find solutions. We have ideas, we just need to be involved.
This has been a message from the Saskatchewan Union of Nurses.
And he says, so my father says he has to go do work stuff or whatever. And I'm like, okay. And my grandmother's like, well, Collier, you're not going to call anybody. We're not going to, because he doesn't want me to call the friends, anybody like that. And I'm like, yeah, that's over my dead body, as my mother would say. So my mother had just purchased a few months earlier a cordless phone. So I go and I grab the cordless phone and I run upstairs to the to my bedroom. And I had hidden, in preparation of anything happening to my mother or anything going on in the household because of my father's violence, I had written down a list of all of my mother's friends' phone numbers. And I had hid it inside a stuffed Garfield that I had. And I grabbed that list and I go into the bathroom and I just start calling everybody on the list. And I tell them what happened. And I tell them, I'm like, look, my father said not to call the police, so you can call the police. If you get my drift.
Technicality.
And essentially, yeah, exactly, right? And two uniformed officers show up in a black and white. And they come in and they're my grandmother is absolutely furious, yelling at me for calling the police. I'm like, I didn't call the police, Grammy, And I'm trying to like talk to the officers, but I can't because my grandmother's literally helicoptering over me, following me and threatening to call my father and everything and yelling at me. And so I do say to one of the police officers, I get him aside while my grandmother's distracted. I said, look, my mother, as my mother would say, I don't trust my father as far as I could throw him. I knew he was a liar. I knew he was violent, but I couldn't say all of this to him. But I just said that. And nothing happens. They leave, nothing happens. So this is New Year's Eve.
Sorry, your grandmother knew, you think?
No.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I don't like as in knew as like she was in on it. No, I don't think that at all. I mean, this is the thing you have to understand about like, so she's Italian. My father's Italian Irish, but this is an Italian mother with her firstborn son. That is a massively unshakable, unbreakable bond. And anyone that knows anything about Italian families and the firstborn son and the mother, it's like they believe everything they say. They can do no wrong. Even if they know that they're a bad person. I mean, I'm sure John Gotti's mother knew that he was a bad person and doing bad things, but she would deny it to her dying breath.
Right.
That's how the scenario was. So, and my father is a masterful manipulator. I mean, this is a psychopath, a sociopath, a narcissist. This wasn't the first time he's gotten away with some nonsense, some bullshit. So, nothing happens. And I reach back out to my mother's friends and I'm like, okay, so what's going on? Like the cops came yesterday because my dad leaves again the next day. And they said, well, we filed a missing persons case and that's where it is. I'm like, she's not missing. It's not like we don't know, like something has happened to her. Like, I'm just like, whatever. What happens is by just the miracle or the grace of God, I get a police officer, a police detective named Lieutenant David Messmore happens to see this missing persons report float through the office. And he goes, this is interesting. A doctor's wife goes missing on New Year's Eve. This is kind of an interesting sort of thing. Oh, well, let me check this out. So he shows up to our house. And my grandmother, again, this is Christmas. I'm sorry, New Year's Day, 1990. And of course, my grandmother is apoplectic. What are you doing? Yeah, I'm going to call my son, blah, blah. He's going to sue you for harassment, yada, yada. So, he gets his way into the house and he's with me. My grandmother goes to the phone, right? So she leaves the room. I grab him. I said, my mother would never leave me. Something has happened to her. Give me your card. I'm going to school tomorrow. I'll call you. So I get his business card. And I'm literally saying my mother would never leave me. My mother would never leave me. And then she comes back and I'm just like super silent and whatever, like, okay, whatever. I'm just trying to be nice. And, he says, well, I want to come back and talk to the doctor later on and I'll be back to talk to him and et cetera, et cetera. And so he leaves and he comes back later on that night. And then my dad's lawyer is there and the whole thing. And that night, even, Sherry, who was my father's girlfriend, had come and prepared a pork roast for us to have New Year's dinner. And my mother was a wonderful cook. This woman was not. And of course, I'm also very bitter about everything that's happening. So I'm just in no mood to eat any.
So like 24 hours later, he's replaced her already.
Like 24 hours later. Yeah, well, he had already replaced her anyways. But I mean, so unbeknownst to me, she was 9 months pregnant at the time. But I didn't know it. She's just a little thing. So I didn't even know this thing. Why would I be thinking this? So, so I go to school the next day, and my first thing I do, I get to school, I make a beeline straight to the principal's office. I give them the business card. I said, you need to call this guy. You need to get him down here, and I want to talk to him. So Dave Messmore comes down to my school, and I lay out over hours. I lay out everything, the entire history of my family, where we came from, my father's proclivity for violence, Sherry, the meetings, violent encounters, all the abuse, everything my mother said, a full-on just day-to-day, play-by-play of the divorce over the last 6 months, 8 months, everything. And I mean, this detective is literally looking at me like, I'm just like, who is this kid? He's like an encyclopedia. And I said to him, I said, look, I'm going to go home tonight. And when my grandmother is downstairs dealing with my adopted sister, because we had this adopted sister from Taiwan in our family at this time, 3 years old. And while she's making dinner, I'm going to go upstairs and I'm going to pull the bookshelves out where our crawl spaces are. I'm going to start looking for my mother's body. I said, then I'm going to start looking for her purse. If I don't find her body, I'm going to start looking for her purse. Because if she didn't leave the house, because my father had told me this whole story, I guess I should back up. On that morning, when I said, where is my mother? He starts explaining the sounds. And he said, my mother threw her purse at him. And that's what I must have heard. It hit the wall. She was screaming at him. She threw her credit cards at him because his story is that my mother and him got into an argument and she stormed out of the house. No winter coat in the dead of winter, New Year's Eve, 1989. She storms out of the house and gets into a car that's waiting for her at the end of the driveway, through the snowy driveway and everything. No coat, no money, no purse, no nothing. Gone.
To Toronto.
No kids. Gone. To wherever she went to. So if you're a Shawshank Redemption fan, say Watson-Ayo, Mexico. There you go. But anyways, so I'm telling all this to Dave, and he's just like, who is this kid? And I do exactly that. Like, I go home that night, she's downstairs doing dinner, like, I'm pulling this stuff out. I don't find anything, right? And the next day I call him and I said, this is what I found, And so I just start, and my father, every night that he comes home, it is just like I am recording him with my eyes. I am paying attention to every single movement, sound, behavior that this man has. Like I'm at a poker table. Like, he's just giving me all these tells, and I start noticing things like he has all these scratches on his hands. He has a bruise. one night he came back home and he asked me to rub his shoulders because with Bengay, which is like an icy hot, which is like for your sore muscles. He had all these stories. And one of the really odd things was I had just gotten a Nintendo that year for Christmas, and I had gotten a fighting game and I was playing it. And he got really upset when I was playing this game called Double Dragon. He's like, I would never have gotten that for you. That it's a violent game. And I'm like, who are you? Like, what, a violent game? Like you who literally gets angry with me for covering my eyes when I don't want to see violence on television, and you're upset that I'm playing a street fighting game on a Nintendo? He had just sort of, everything had just changed with this man. And there's, like I said, a massive proclivity for violence. And every night, Dave Mesmore is coming to my house. My father's meeting with his attorney, and I see Dave at the door trying to talk to my dad. And it's like, we have this little secret going on. And he ignores me and I ignore him. Like, I don't know who this man is, right? Meanwhile, every day at school, I am calling him or he's coming down and we are talking and I'm sharing him with what I find.
You're the lead investigator of
Yes, 100%.
A 10-year-old kid?
Which is so bizarre when I think about it now. I was 11 years old at the time. And I was almost 12. My birthday is February 28th, so I was almost 12. And this is mid-January. And so this is where it all starts to break. So I go with my father. My father says, hey, I'm going to go to my office to pick up some paperwork. Do you want to come with me? And I'm like, yeah, bro. I am watching you. And we go to his office, we get this paperwork, and on the way back, we stop at the gas station. And my father is getting gas. My father also is eating these things called like Mallow cups, which are like marshmallow Reese cup thing. It's super weird. Whatever. He's really into them. And he goes into the gas station, and I'm watching him in the gas station, and I start rummaging through his truck. I open up the center console of his truck, and I find 2 Polaroid photographs. One is of a house that I've never seen before. And the second one is of his girlfriend, Sherry Campbell, with her 2 children, who I've met, sitting in front of a fireplace that's covered in plastic, like it's a new fireplace. And I'm like, this house and this fireplace and these people are all connected. So I go to the school next day and I tell Dave Mesmore what I find. And I start to, and like I said, I'm building all this like stuff up and observing all these things of my father and his behaviors and everything. And I'm reporting all this back, but I don't hear from Dave for a couple of days. But I do start to notice that my father's behavior is becoming more and more like he's under duress. Like something's going on. He's got the attorney, his divorce attorney there every night. Obviously the police keep coming to talk to him. There's signs out in front of my house saying no press, no press, no police. We're not talking to anyone. Don't talk to the family, et cetera, right? So I'm observing all of this. And my father says to me, he says, Collier, we're driving or something's going on. And he says, I know it's been really hard for you since mommy has left us. Basically your mother has left us high and dry. I know you're really hurting. I think it would be really good. I have a medical conference in Florida coming up in a couple of days. And I think we should take a father and son bonding trip down to Florida with this medical conference and really bond. Now, the interesting thing about these medical conferences is every year my family and we would go to these medical conferences in Clearwater Beach, Florida. The interesting thing about this particular conference is all of these conferences were in the spring because they were obviously timed around spring break for families. Kids are out of school. They can make a vacation out of it. The doctors can do their thing. The whole family comes along, go to Busch Gardens, go to the beach. It's a fun time, right? This is the middle of January, right after spring, right after Christmas break, all this stuff. And my bullshit meter is just like, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, I'm not coming back from Florida. And I go to school the next day, call Dave Mesmore, say, hey, Dave, this is what's going down. He wants to take me to Florida. And I have been able to swim since I was 4 years old. I'm going to drown mysteriously in the Gulf of Mexico. So you got to get me out of my house. And I, again, I don't hear from him, but a couple of days later, I wake up and there are two strangers in my bedroom and they're like, we're from Child Protective Services. We need you to pack a bag for you and your sister. You got 20 minutes. And I hear all this commotion downstairs. I say to them, I said, can I take my dog? And they said, we'll come back for your dog. I never saw my dog again. I packed a bag for myself and for my sister and tried to gather all of her stuff. And as I'm coming downstairs, the entire house is filled with men and women in white lab coats, badges, search warrants, cars. I mean, police cars everywhere. It is just, and like, it's like one of those moments when like reality sets in. Like, you're like, okay, shit has just hit the fan. Okay, I'm probably not coming back to this house.
Yeah.
They've got all these machines in there and everything, and I'm like, this is over. Like, this is like, I don't know what this looks like, but this is not good.
It's the first day of the rest of your life.
I mean, I guess, I wish I could say it had stopped there, but it didn't. But so I go to school, or I'm sorry, I don't go to school that day. I go to my principal's house she's a family friend and whatever. And so a woman comes to meet me and she's a caseworker. And she's like, hi, Collier, I'm your caseworker. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't know what the hell a caseworker is, but I know it's not good. Like, I don't care what it is that we're going to talk about. Like, I think I'm pretty sure what's going to go down. But I know it's not. I know none of it is like, hey, there's a rainbow and there's a pot of gold and there's Mickey Mouse and some leprechauns and your mom. It's gonna be fun.
Yeah.
No. And I'm just like, this is just the worst. So, as I told you, I'm really heavily asthmatic, and that I had to get out of my house so quickly. Like, I didn't have my medicine or anything like that. So that night, I probably have, I'm staying in this house and I don't know if they had cats. I'm deathly allergic to cats, just all this stuff, right? And I have the worst asthma attack of my life. So it's so bad that I think I'm going to die. And I'm just fighting for every breath.
Well, that would have been ironic.
And it is somewhat ironic. So, the next morning, they take me to the hospital to get a breathing treatment, and I go and I remember like very distinctly, I'm going into the emergency room, and there's like an honor box with the newspaper, and I remember I'm being shuffled away from that oddly, and I'm brought into this little like side room, and then a doctor, friend of the family, comes in, and he gives me a breathing treatment and the whole thing, and I start to feel better. He gives me a steroid injection, and it's like, okay, you're good to go. And then that's when they say, Collier, Lieutenant Messmore found your mother. And she was dead. And it's really, really hard to articulate it's hard to articulate to anyone who's never been through this before what it is like to have this sort of, dichotomy of emotions or juxtaposition, if you will, where on one hand, you feel this overwhelming relief that like what you knew in your heart and your head and everything that you've been going through in the last like 25, 26, 27 days, almost a month, was true. On the flip side, the overwhelming amount of sadness that just comes cascading down over you because what you thought had happened was true. And that's probably the hardest thing out of all this. And I wish I could say that it all sort of like that was the worst of it, that it sort of hit the nadir, but no.
It got worse.
That was just the start. Because what ended up happening was just a complete and total just circus, and I shudder to think if this had happened in the age of TikTok and Twitter and social media and the internet, but it was a fiasco. And, I testified against my father at the grand jury to secure his indictment. Then my mother's sister, who she was not very friendly with at the time. They were never really friendly I could ever remember, but, overly friendly. But my aunt loved me and I knew that. And we would see them. We would go on vacation. We'd spend time with them and stuff. But, I thought, okay, I'm going to go and be with my family. And my mother's sister was my godmother. I'll never forget. She told me, we're not going to take you and we can't take you because you look like your father. And my father's side of the family was very convinced that I had caused all of this. My father was arrested illegally or whatever you want to call it. And that, none of this was true and that I should be, excoriated or at least, I was manipulated somehow to coming up with this story and I'm going to rescind everything and I'm going to say I'm lying or whatever nonsense they wanted me to do. So I was remanded to the foster care system. I was orphaned officially at almost age 12. And everyone turned their back on me.
So you don't know your family now?
Not really. No. It's never really been anything, really.
And I'm assuming the adopted sister, you never really saw her again?
Well, so we were placed in the same foster care home and they wanted to adopt her. So they sort of separated me from her so she could bond with their family. And I was just sort of like, whatever. And
Jesus.
And, I was the main witness against my father. So for the 6 months during the pre-trial, I wasn't really allowed to associate with a lot of people. I most certainly wasn't allowed to turn on the television or read the newspaper, really have conversations. And, the one person in my life that could have made all of this okay was gone. And, I sort of in my darkest point in my life, I had to find the strength within myself and the courage to testify against my father. And the prosecutor even said, we don't need you to testify. I said, that is over my dead body. Absolutely, I'm going to testify. But it still was so difficult because you become acutely aware of the fact that your father is a high-powered legal team, and here you are, just a kid, right? And you begin to realize that there's no good none of this plays out in a positive, in a really positive way. There's really shitty, really bad, or even worse, or abysmal. There's no those are your options. So let's try to land at the least worst case scenario because they're all bad. But you start to think if I testify against my father and he gets acquitted, I'm going to go back into his custody. And I'm either going to be found underneath the basement floor of a house in another state or I'm going to be tortured the rest of my life. Hey, remember when you tried to put me in prison for murdering your mother? By the way, I did, but they can't charge me again because there's no double jeopardy according to the US Constitution. I knew that was a very real possibility. But I still, and I tell this to a lot of people, when I do coaching stuff or when I speak at places or I talk to young people that are going through all of this or just even anybody that goes through this type of stuff, right? Or not, not even this, because thank God a lot of people don't go through this. People do, and it's horrible. But I always tell people when they're so in awe of everything I've been through, I'm like, look, your experiences are unique to you, and just because I've been I'm the exception, not the rule. Just because my stuff is so wackadoo, that's don't look at it that way. Your experiences are validated for what you're feeling and what you've been through, right? People, domestic abuse situations, sexual violence against them as children and things, sexual trafficking, all those horrible. So I said, but what I say to people is the thing that I am most grateful for every morning that I wake up is I can look myself in the mirror and I know I was honest. I did the right thing. I told the truth, and I stood up for what I believed in. I stood up for my mother, stood up for my family, despite all the consequences, which was losing my family, losing my way of life, losing everything, right? I'm still so grateful that I made that decision because it's made me who I am. And the whole experience has made me who I am. And I really, honestly, I like that guy. But I also, and it's so weird to articulate this, but it's almost like you begin to look at a situation like this and you're so grateful for it, even though it's so horrific, because you're like, I've come out the other side of that. And just the fact that I had like that future hindsight that I'm like, I'm going to regret this for the rest of my life if I don't do this, as difficult as it is to go in there in the court. You know, it's like when I made my documentary and people were like, oh, he gave videotape testimony. I'm like, no, the testimony was on videotape. I wasn't videotaped in some private room. I was in the courtroom at 12 years old as a minor, staring down my father in court saying, you murdered my mother. And I'm going to make sure you go to prison the rest of your life. You're not going to get away with this. And if you do get away with this, I'm going out swinging, man. And that is the thing that I can always, like, when I look, if I walked out today and got smacked by a bus or something, I can literally say I did everything I could to bring justice for my mother, including what I did afterwards with my life, you know. And you know, my father, the trial was a month long. I testified for 2 days on the witness stand. And, you know, it's weird because people will see my testimony and they go, wow, it was so well rehearsed. You were clearly coached. And I'm like, no. I'm like, do you know why it's so believable and it sounds so good? And they're like, why? I'm like, because the truth is the easiest thing to remember. So when somebody's telling the truth, it's so pure it flows. Because you're telling the truth. It's the easiest thing to remember. And you don't need to color it with anything because it's the fact, like, you know, and when you're dealing with somebody who is a psychopath and a narcissist and a human of that, I mean, a human being who is capable of such horrifying behavior, you just give these people enough rope and they'll hang themselves. And that's what my father ultimately did. I mean, hubris was his downfall. He thought no cops would be smart enough to catch him. Nobody would be this. And the downfall is that his 11-year-old son is the one who caught him.
Man, it sounds like if I was watching a movie and this was happening, I'd be like, that's bullshit. A 12-year-old kid would do all this and make it like as if that would ever happen. Like, it sounds like, what the fuck? Like, were you 50 years old when you were 12? Like, how did you have that?
My mother used to joke with people. So I was like, 11. And so she'd be like, yeah, he's 11 going on 40.
Yeah,
she always make jokes like that. This was, I mean, the thing is that like so both of my parents were Ivy League educated. In fact, my whole family is, right? So my whole natural family or birth family. So like they all went to Penn, and education was held in very high regard in my family. We were readers. I didn't grow up. I mean, I watched television, but I wasn't a kid that was like, my mom would put on the television to entertain me. If the television was on, it was a VHS tape of me like learning a science program or something. That's what I was allowed to watch. You know what I mean? It wasn't like mindless, senseless television. I was the kid who would get out of school for the summer. He would play with his friends for a week, and then he would go back into summer school for art, science, music, math, whatever it is. And I loved it. I'm such a wonk. I love diving into learning new things. I'm constantly curious. I'm always thinking of the things and just creative ways to learn. It's just who I am. It's what I learned from my mother. It's what I learned from my father. we were the family that like would go eat and then go to the bookstore and hang out for hours on end, you know? And I that's just what I love. I still love that, you know? And I,
So he helped create the guy that caught him. Really?
yeah, in a lot of ways. And it's like, I remember I used to read my father's medical books and like, you know, what was the little viewfinder thing? It was like red with the orange little thing. Anyways, that spin around. And I would look at like organs, like cut apart and the Viewmasters. Thank you.
Yeah, there you go.
Viewmasters. And I would do a little Viewmaster and would have the organ spliced. And this is the inside of a kidney. This is the inside of the valves of a heart. And so that's the stuff I was into. And so I just had this natural curiosity and I had this overwhelming love for my mother. And I was just like, this guy's not going to get away with it.
Mm-hmm.
Just not going to get away with it.
But like you were telling the cops what to do. It's like, this is what I'm going to do when I go home. This is what you're going to do. And let's catch up tomorrow.
Absolutely. But like also, I mean, like, you know, Dave Messmore, I mean, they did such fine work on this, right? And I mean, you know, I think about it now and, you know, even, you know, I have my podcast, Moving Past Trauma. I have my, you know, my film, A Murder in Mansfield. I have all the things that I do. And I talk to so many guests, but I talk to people that reach out and this, you know, being proactive and when it comes to like missing persons cases, because a lot of the times, like, let's not mince words here. 95% of the time, missing person, it's a woman and it's coming out of some domestic violence situation or there's a divorce or something. And there's just there, a lot of times and they don't find out the answers, right? And I was so proactive and getting my mother's friends proactive and so we could get those answers because there are so many people in this world that don't get that justice, that don't get those answers. I mean, and they don't know where their loved one is or what happened. And it's horrible. So I'm very, very fortunate that I did what I did and that people listened to me. And you know, I think about things like the pandemic when kids couldn't go to school, right? And how, or, you know, people couldn't go to work. And I thought, you know, there's been this, you know, massive surge in people learning, like, I think gaslighting was the 2022 word of the year or something. And so you know, people were like really interested in narcissism and gaslighting because they're coming out of these being locked inside with someone for a year and a half. And they're discovering this isn't the partner I married, but you think about the people that were in domestically abusive situations and these kids were able to go to school and they escaped that and they had some sort of sense of normalcy. If I didn't have that to go to school and to be able to be like, I am in a safe place where no one is going to hurt me and I can talk to the police, I don't know what would have happened. I'm pretty much convinced that what did happen would not have happened because I wouldn't have had those opportunities. So I'm so blessed in so many ways. I know that sounds really weird to people like, oh, you've been through so much, you're blessed. Yeah, I am blessed because I was able to do something with it. And I had people that listened to me. And obviously I was a very, you know, whatever, I was a very annoying little 11-year-old boy, almost 12 years old. Like, you're going to listen to me and I'm going to find these clues. I'm going to, you know, but,
give me your
but
card
at the
quick.
same time, you know, and I'm going to do this and I'm going to find this, you know, obviously, I mean, it was, you know, and everybody kept saying, even Dave Mesmer was like, this kid, like this captain is saying, if you don't find, this guy's a doctor, like, we're not going after to say, like, yeah, but this kid is convinced, like, this kid is convincing me. And I don't, you know, and I'm so grateful for all of that because you know, I shudder to think what the outcome would have been. So anyways, I've talked for a long time and sort of told that whole backstory, but
now we have no time to talk about how you were treated with trauma and how that happened. But
yeah, I guess, yeah, that's a whole other thing. But I mean, you know,
maybe another time.
Yeah, I mean, you can bring me back and I will tell you all the rest of it happened because it's, you know, I stayed in the same community growing up. So I had to live with all this.
Oh, so your foster home was in the community?
Yes. I was adopted when I was 13 and by a family of strangers who ended up, you know, obviously being wonderful people. I wanted to be adopted by Dave Messmore and his wife.
Oh man.
The investigator, but I was not awarded custody to them. I had really bonded with them after the trial and everything when I could just be a normal little kid. And I really loved them and I wanted to be with them, but I ended up getting adopted by another family who I also love and who are wonderful people, and they had a massive family. I was an only child up until 6 months before my mother was murdered. Also, they only had one child, but they had brothers and sisters, 9 brothers and sisters, and 5, this, and so it was like this huge family I got adopted into, which was wild for me. But I stayed in that community, and I grew up with that, having, everyone knew who I was, and I worked my entire life, and all I ever wanted to do was get out. Not because I had anything against the community, because the community was very supportive in their own ways. I mean, they couldn't be directly supportive to me during the trial, but everybody tuned in, and everybody was, obviously felt so much towards my mother and myself and, the family, and just were really devastated by that this could happen in the community. But they also, everybody knew me and everybody knew my story, and I didn't want to be known for that.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to go out in the world and plant my own flag. And I got out as fast as humanly possible. I basically harnessed all of my trauma and said, I'm going to do something positive with this in the world. And that's what I wanted to do. But I knew the only way that I could do that is if I could get out of a situation where everyone knew me for what I went through and go to a place where nobody knew me with a couple $1,000 in my pocket. I'm going to go out. I'm going to make it on my own. Nobody's going to know a thing about me. And then I made a movie.
Thank you so much, Collier. Your story is fascinating, and it's much appreciated having it told by you. I look forward to speaking with you again, and we could talk about your recovery and your. Collier also does like trauma coaching and stuff, so we can talk about that as well. So yeah, thank you. Hey, please follow the podcast on Instagram at Bunny Hugs Podcast, on Facebook Bunny Hugs Mental Health, and on TikTok Bunny Hugs Podcast. And please rate and review the podcast on Apple or whatever app you're listening to right now. Honestly, reviews and ratings, it's huge for podcasters. So if you listened to this episode, or if you've listened to other episodes, please rate and review. And speaking of reviews, I got one here now. This is from Misty Freeze, one of my top regular podcasts. 5 stars. Todd is such a genuine and laid-back guy. He connects well with his guests, and the topics are so relatable. Listening to this podcast has helped me recognize mental health patterns in myself, and also learn about different perspectives from people with mental health different from my own. Thank you, Misty Freeze. It is much appreciated. The best way you can support a podcast is by giving ratings and reviews. And like they said, they're getting help from listening to podcasts like this to be able to relate and stuff. So honestly, people are getting all types of help from my guests. So if you want to passively support mental health services in some way, I swear the best way you can do it is 1, telling people about the podcast, and 2, rating and reviewing the podcast on Apple or whatever app you're listening to the podcast on right now. People are being educated and people are getting help from my guests. So why not? How hard is it just to tell some people about it? Anywho, I've got great guests coming up. Next week, Jeremy Evans. And on Monday on Instagram Live, I'm speaking with Allie, ADHD coach. Please check those out. And please make your beds and take your meds. Bye.